Hello, welcome back to another episode of Soul Sessions with Creative Mind.
We're continuing our series on Like a Spark from Fire, Debra's new book. And this time we're talking about how the mother influences the daughter's personality development, life, and how it plays into relationships.
And how to escape your mother's shadow.
If that's possible.
Yeah. So let's start with just what the shadow is. A shadow is something that's unconscious. It's a part of our personality that we repress or reject. And it basically remains hidden to us. We can even act out the shadow, but not realize that we're doing that. That's why it's like a blinder to us.
Yeah.
And when we what we do is end up projecting it out in the world. So those irritating people we admire and people we disdain they're reflective of aspects of that shadow, the self that we don't identify with. So if you think about your conscious self, you have an identity, you have a relationship, a self-concept. Anything that doesn't fit into that self-concept that would be socially acceptable would go in the shadow.
Yeah.
And so
I do want to say a word about the mother, though, because we're not being critical of mothers and mothering. And if we sound that way, it's not our intention. We're simply shedding light on Jung's idea of the importance of the relationship with the mother, especially early on, and how it imprints on the individual's history or life history throughout.
So let's start with, why is the mother such a critical role? Because a lot of people, I know I worked with women over the years and with love and relationships, and a lot of their issues really were with their father, and then some with the mother, but it was almost like...
Really?
Yeah.
I found the opposite. But
well, maybe because I thought my issues, my consciousness...
Right, we're seeing our own shadow.
Yeah, you see, when you're a coach, you see people like you that have the same narrative and the same story that fits. Although I do have attracted a lot of clients that had issues with their mother, and they liked me because I was kind, and they were critical of their mother was critical of them. And so it was kind of like a nice thing. Even men, had a critical mother or cold mother. And it was like having that coach-client relationship helped them cultivate a more nurturing kind of idea of what a mother could be. So, but for me personally, I always thought like my issues were with my father, not with my mother, and just never paid attention to the impact my mother had on my life. So, yeah, but as we go along, Rob and I have been doing this for how many years? 15 years. And and separately longer than that. We kept thinking, wow, the mother is really arising in this powerful way.
Yeah, so in theory, it goes back to Freud. Freud was one of the first ones to talk about kind of the deeper psychology of family. And then, of course, family systems came up and all those things. And but Jung, of course, was interested in the relationship of this archetypal element with the mother. He saw the mother, pretty much the child projects the mother archetype onto the personal mother. And so the mother is expected to be this godlike or goddess-like creature because of that projection, because of the archetype. To be there, everything for that child. And really, that you think about it, that is the mother's responsibility, is make sure that child is safe, especially in those early ages. And then, of course, they say being a mother, Maya Angelou famously said, being a mother is like having your heart walk outside your body the rest of your life. So there's this really like a responsibility. The mother, like not only the child projects, but the mother feels that she has to live up to. Yeah, so the primary relationship, that's Freud's idea, right? That the primary relationship we have in life is with the mother, because it's the first template that you get regarding what is a relationship and what can I expect about relationships. So obviously we're raised by flawed human beings just like us. I mean, think about this. Your mother was not a divine creature. She was flawed like all of us are.
And on the ego level, on a deep level, she was a spark from fire, but she presented herself. Her personality was the human personality.
Yes, we're talking about the psychology
Yeah.
here. So at the psychological level, she had hang-ups, she had character flaws like all of us. And so that imprint of the primary relationship with a mother that you got early on kind of gave you that subtle understanding of what you can expect in relationships for the rest of your life, unless you do shadow work, right? That would be that's why we place such importance on shadow work, because if you don't reveal the shadow, if you don't understand what is in the unconscious mind regarding that primary relationship, that's what plays out for you the rest of your life, not only in relationships, but in work settings, in your self-image, in the way you see the world in general. Because the archetype...
I was going to say matter is
Yes.
mata, which is the translates into mother, right?
Yes, the primal matter is essentially the creation of the world, the way we experience it. So a little bit of Jungian alchemical theory there.
And it's really interesting. There's a movie out that's up for an award. It's called The Lost Daughter, and it really, really, if you haven't seen it yet, it really depicts the shadow of the mother, like what the choices this mother made, it's just, for many people, it's a little disturbing because it kind of takes it to the extreme of that projection of the mother needs to be a certain way, and it's so terrible, and it will stir you up. But I want you to challenge you, that if you watch it, to look at what is it that that you're surmising from your own mother relationship, and how can it open up a deeper self-inquiry into what patterns have you created in your life to push away these dark, we would say dark in a nothing's really dark, but it just seems like out of the norm of social convention, this mother established herself. So really, really powerful movie. So anyway, I think about the shadow is the things that the mother had to reject in order to be the mother for you, or to survive in whatever situation she was in, whether she was with an abusive husband, and what did she have to, maybe she had to be quiet and submissive in order to make sure you kids were safe. But as a child, you see her as weak. And so there's all these like deeper stories than what you surmise as a child. And then you make these judgments, and then you decide, I like this persona, this is power, this is weakness, and you kind of sort personality traits out that way, and then it molds you into this personality that you think is really naturally you, but it's really constructed by your early life experience. So the you that you think you are isn't really you.
Right. Okay. So for the daughter, which is the mother, then is the same-sex parent. She either identifies with the mother's persona or rejects the mother's persona. But the mother, of course, has a persona and a shadow. And again, like you were saying, the persona is the part that she shows to society, how she presents herself to others. The shadow are those elements that were rejected and pushed into the unconscious. But they're there. And as children, we're really good at picking up what is going on in the shadow as well, intuitively, instinctually. Of course, we don't reason it out. But let's say for the daughter, then, identifying with the mother's persona, she takes those elements of how she sees the mother act in social settings and says, I'm going to be like that. In other words, she's creating a persona that's very similar to her mother. At the same time, of course, she's acquiring the mother's shadow.
Unconsciously.
Yes.
Like accepting the mother's shadow.
Yes.
And living out the same patterns the mother presents it. The obstacles that or the struggles she has with that persona, the daughter tends to play out those same struggles, the same limitations.
On the other hand, and this often happens, of course, especially since the generational kind of patterns were broken severely in recent years, where the daughter rejects the mother's persona, the housewife or the stay-at-home mom or the subservient wife, who kind of bows or puts her dreams aside in order to fulfill the role of the wife and mother. And when a woman rejects that role, the persona, that persona of the mother then goes into her shadow. So it remains in the shadow until she does shadow work, or if she does shadow work.
And I see this in a lot of people that have kids I've worked with. There's this mother guilt, this bad mom in the shadow, this kind of concept of a bad mom. And if you think about these concepts, these self-concepts, they're very subjective, because in a certain culture, the mother's expected to do a lot more. In a Western culture, it might be different. Different religions, the role of a woman and the role of mother is interpreted differently. So we kind of adopt unconsciously what we think is right and wrong through our culture, our family, and how things are. And then we don't even question it, and we think bad mother means whatever we've been conditioned to believe, versus that there really is this concept of a bad mother or a good mother. A lot of times when the mother, like you worked with children for many years and families, a mother who would seem to be a good mother, who's always there for the child, who never lets the child fail, who's always bolstering up the child. You're terrific and you're wonderful. You may think, oh, that's a good mother. But then there's always a negative side to that too, or limiting side, because then the child thinks that they don't have any kind of self-criticism or learn to ask themselves those questions. They think I'm just great. And, they become, they could not narcissistic, but they become almost like, I don't know, there could be some limiting aspects from that as well. To always hear you're so great. And then you go out into the world on the playground and someone makes fun of you. You don't know how to cope with that. You're just like, wait a minute, Mom says I'm great. This is something strange, and then that could also affect the child. And so there's this idea of this perfect parent. I think is those have to do more with parenting styles. There are different parenting styles that have been identified, but really in the shadow work, it's more the emotional imprint. For example, if as a baby you cry and your mother is very nurturing and always attentive to your cries, the impression, of course, is that the world is going to take care of you. That whenever you need help, whatever you need and desire, or you're uncomfortable, that there's going to be help for you, that the world is going to provide for you in a sense. That is imprinted emotionally into every cell of your body, essentially. So at the crux of it is the world going to be there for me or not?
Yes.
So let me ask you this as a child psychologist, retired child psychologist. What if the child is not attended to, and the only time that child gets attention is if she throws a tantrum or is throws a lot of drama or starts a fight? Maybe that's her way. Because it's harder to get attention, she would repeat that pattern as an adult. This is the way I get people to pay attention to me.
Yeah, I mean that's let's say a good question. But development is a moving target. In other words, what is true in the first few years of life is not true later on. So it would depend on
if that always works for them.
Yeah, and what part of development are you talking about? Early development, from before the kid goes off to school, or later on. So a lot of it has to do with those early years. Now, those early years, and we know in developmental psychology, it keeps pushing it back, saying essentially that the earliest years are the most important.
When you say early years, what are you saying? So under 8 or 5?
From 0 to 6, really important.
That's the emotional template.
Very important years, yes. And ironically, that's when parents think the kid is too small to understand. They're too little to comprehend what's going on in the family.
Like if you're fighting with the spouse and then they're like, oh, the baby doesn't know. The baby's
yes, that's right.
She's in the other room or he's in the other room. They don't know what's going on.
Right. And that's not what's happening. The kid is like a sponge absorbing everything that's going on in the family, especially the emotional life of the family. And that imprint, of course, is a big part of what is in the shadow, what is in the personal unconscious, as we coach people through that process.
I find that people, men and women, who haven't received that nurturing from the mother, like when they cry and they haven't received that nurturing, they are almost, and you can agree or disagree or counter what I'm saying, is that my experience is that they tend to suppress their emotion because that desire to be loved and the desire to be want that attention, almost like since it wasn't attended to, they learn to suppress that need. That would go into the shadow. That craving for connection and intimacy would basically go in the shadow because they never got it, so they have to find a way to survive and not need it because needing it is too painful.
Right. So here you get into these different schools. So behaviorism would definitely say, well, all behavior, because you're observing behavior. Like, what does the parent do when the child cries? It explains the outcome, basically, the conditioning. But you have to remember, each individual has kind of a built-in resilience level and built-in traits and predispositions genetically programmed already. And so you could treat the two children identically the same, attend to their cries or not attend to their cries, and you'll have two different outcomes.
So what you're really saying is, stop blaming your mother.
Yes, that's part of it.
A lot of times, too, I've worked with so many people over the years, and sometimes the mother, you're like the youngest of 10 kids or 8 kids, and the mother can't give the attention that you need. And there's other circumstances happening, and the child is perceiving the experience in their own, like you said, one child who has more self-sufficiency to find their own nurturing and ability to have resilience, like you said. And then another child that genetically might not have it as clear, they would have a different experience of that mother or that kind of childhood. And so really we look at the childhood and say make some generalizations, but each individual, it doesn't fit into a checkpoint. Like if your mother did this, then you have this, this kind of trauma attached to you, like they tend to do with the labels, and everyone who's been abandoned by their mother is, has this trait, or everyone who's been super nurtured by their mother is having this trait. And that's what you're saying is that it's so subjective and on many different levels.
Very individualized. But the individual then, whatever their experience and their interpretation of that experience is what they carry on into life.
So it's really the interpretation, and that interpretation comes from how they've learned, almost like you said, genetically dispositioned. Isn't there something where people have a higher state of hopefulness or looking at things from a possibility versus a negative way, and so we have all these gradations of how we perceive the world and the stories we make up, not even from the event itself, but who we've been kind of adopted and inherited.
Absolutely.
Because you look at families, and there's people in the family who all grew up in the same household, and some are really positive, right? You see, where did this person come from? She's so positive. And then another person could be, the sibling could be just very poor me and a victim.
Yes, because of that interpretation. So that interpretation, we can say, is the persona, right? It's the way you take that information of what was going on in your early family history, and you turn it into, this is the way I'm going to be. These are the things I identify as, and the way I see myself presenting myself to the world, that becomes your persona. The Jung says that that's not a problem. It's not a problem. It's a good thing. You have to build a good, viable persona.
It helps you function in the world.
Exactly, and that's kind of what your book is about. You're talking about these personas that people or women adopt as their primary roles in life, and the shadow is simply the things you pushed away, and that's what gets people. That's what Jung says. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it's going to direct your life. So your persona is not actually going to direct your life. What's going to direct your life is your shadow, the things that you pushed into the unconscious mind.
A very common experience for me was that I thought my mother was wonderful and loving, and I still do. She's amazing. And I just adored her. But the part of me that saw her as like the submissive housewife, I saw that as very limiting. Where my siblings, my sister, one of my sisters thought it would, like, that's the role you should. She became my mother in all those ways, and my other sister became like more extreme. I'm kind of in the middle. How we misperceived that role, and I wanted consciously to be like her. I wanted to have kids. I wanted to get married, and then I kept going for men that were unavailable, and I was like, why am I doing that? Because in the shadow was this fear of being controlled, this fear of a man, running my life and all that I didn't examine. And so unconsciously, I was playing out my shadow in a way that I wasn't being the mother. I put my mother in my shadow, even though consciously I thought I'm just like her. And I pursued career, and I did all these things that on a conscious level, I was like, this is not what I plan or intend, but it's just kind of what you fall into the pattern. It's almost like you feel like life circumstances are driving this. Well, there's not enough men in the town, or, maybe it's my father's fault. But inevitably, when I realized I was the one who was choosing to be single because I really was terrified of being that submissive wife, everything started to change. Everything changed after that. But we think we're making these conscious decisions, and we think we're not being the shadow, but then we end up acting out the shadow, and we don't even realize it because it's so unconscious.
That's it. And by the same token, when you do make the unconscious conscious, in other words, when you do shadow work, when you integrate the shadow, as Jung would say, then you have free will. That's real free will, because then you can make decisions not based on your early imprints in the family womb, like you're in this bubble of the family. You're free to really choose who you want to be beyond the persona, beyond that role that you created to keep you safe and secure. And you have real conscious choices then.
So the ego actually creates the persona shadow dynamic from this limited survival mind. And so even if we, on a conscious level, we think, like I said, like I wanted love and it sounded like great, but the conflict in me was I don't want this either. So that inner conflict is the persona shadow conflict. And we all have them. And that's why it's if we really don't have a choice when we meet someone, how much money we make, what kind of body we have health-wise, even our sense of self from a spiritual level. If we don't understand that persona shadow dynamic and make it conscious, we think it's fate. Like Jung says, we think it's fate. I thought it was fate that I was meant to be single. And when I realized it wasn't that I needed to now say, okay, I'm going to play the role of the submissive wife, or I'm not going to be the independent woman, I actually said, I don't need to choose either of those things, because that's what the ego, as a child, thought those were my two choices. It's like door number 3, like the third option, which is you choose freely. You're not choosing not to be like your mother, or you're not choosing to be like your mother out of conditioning. You're choosing something fresh and different. And that's really what we need in the world. We don't need carbon copies of each other and just kind of repeating patterns. We need people to wake up and really choose their life, and that's where we feel fulfilled.
It is a metamorphosis. You can think of the caterpillar. Our early life is like being that caterpillar, just kind of surviving and storing up food for later. But then there comes that period that Jung called the individuation process, where you're meant to transform yourself, to really be free and acquire your wings, or whatever metaphor you want to use, and fly. And that is the individuation process. But it requires, of course, Jung says, without the emotions, there is no transformation. So a lot of people think, well, if I know my patterns, if I can see my patterns from my family history, and a lot of people get that insight from therapy or from reading books, from self-help seminars.
Doing worksheets, you ask yourself, self-inquiry. Sometimes just kind of your mind will find a way to connect everything, and it makes it really rational. Like, oh, now I know why I'm this way.
But that's not enough. Insight is not enough. It will not enact the transformation, because it's all in your head. It's all cerebral. You have to face that initial imprint, and remember that initial imprint was an emotional, intuitive understanding, or a kind of an interpretation of who you are and what's possible for you in the world. That imprint was kind of imprinted in your unconscious mind.
And I think that the ego will make a story up. And Jung said that there's kind of before you get into the shadow, there's this peripheral perception that it feels like it's unconscious. It's just beneath the consciousness, is kind of like on the side. And then the ego will use that narrative to make everything make sense. So when I was doing, first self-help, the narrative was, you don't have a man because your father doesn't show love to you. That was the surface information. So if I just build my confidence and I said I'm lovable, then a man would love me, right? And then that would be great. And it makes a lot of sense. And so the ego will make insight make sense to you, almost like where you're not getting to the emotion. And, it's my mother told me a story about my mother's reading my book, and she loves it. And I was like, wow, that's so cool. But she told me a story that I never heard before, and I wanted to share it because for men too, they're very influenced by the mother. And so through my whole life, my father didn't really show emotion or affection. My mother told me the story, and now it makes so much sense. But as a child, you think they don't love you. There's something wrong with you. You make this narrative up. And then I was trying to fix that story that I am good enough, and I don't care if my father doesn't love me, and I'm strong and powerful. But what she told me was that her and my father went to this personal development, like for Catholics. It's called Close Encounters. And she was talking about her emotions, and my father got in touch with his emotions, and he couldn't wait to get home and hug the kids and hug us. And then he went to his mother, who's a Danish woman, very, very reserved. And he went up to her to hug her. And she said, wait, what are you doing? Do you have a cold? And she's like, a handshake will do. You don't have to hug me. And that tells me everything about my father's conditioning. And no wonder he didn't even have the capacity, because his mother never gave him love. So he must have put that, his shadow was full of emotion, full of passion. And when we talked about, like early on, like 10 years ago, we talked about, or longer than that, we talked about our feelings. Everything started to change. So instead of me saying, I need to be good enough and all that, it was more like I needed to connect intimately with a man. And I needed to learn to be not unafraid of sharing that, getting into that emotional place with someone and sharing that. And that's where it opened me up for love. So it's like the problem that initially that your mind tells you, that ego narrative is going to fit a story that makes so much sense, right? And you feel like, oh, I got it. I see the pattern. But nothing's changing. That means you're not really getting into the shadow, which is that it's a deeper, it's almost like I can't even explain it in words of the shift that happened within me. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, the theory is that it's unconscious.
Yeah.
So by definition, the unconscious, you cannot see it. You can't, in other words, you can't look inside your mind as we can with our thoughts, right? We can hear and see our thoughts. The unconscious thinking or perceiving an emotional imprint is imperceptible to us. We cannot observe it. We cannot see it. But it's there. So the question is, how can we access the unconscious mind? That's where Jungian theory comes in. He developed specific techniques to access the unconscious mind.
Because you can't look at it directly.
You cannot.
So if you look at your relationship with your mother and just generally, if you say, okay, I'm looking at my relation with my mother when you were young, because it could change as an adult. How do you perceive yourself in that relationship? Like how the mother treated you? Was it good or bad? Is it welcoming? Is the world? And then like basically it's how the world treats you. So if you feel like your mother, it wasn't loving, wasn't there for you, was dangerous, was critical, you're going to project that into the world. So you're going to feel like everyone's criticizing you. You're going to feel like it's unsafe. You're going to feel like people leave relationships all the time. And you're going to perceive this projection of your relationship with your mother onto the world. And then the world isn't really in your control, right? You're trying to still win the love of the mother through the world.
That's true. You'll see that overcompensating, like trying to be very successful or very charming, et cetera, as a way to compensate or to please.
Yeah.
To please people.
And I always say pleasing is a defense because it sounds like a nice thing, like to be pleasing, but it really is the reason most of us please is to avoid the other person being mad at us or avoid someone being disappointed in us. And so a lot of young women would please, if they had a critical mother, they would please their way through the early life because that's what helped them survive, right? We don't upset the mother, walk on eggshells. Here, Mom, I'm going to do the extra chores for you. And then it becomes a part of our, we think that's who we are then. We forget that we're reacting to something early on and then we think that's who we are. Or we could be the opposite, the daughter that rebels and, does the goth or paints her hair a different color and, is just like nonconformist and rejects the mother. And then that's her kind of go-to survival kit to go out in the world and then she'll go out in the world as an adult and needs to be that rebel all the time, needs to stir things up. And, so it really is very interesting how your early life does really create the world that you see and perceive when a lot of times it's a misperception. It's like a veil that covers the truth of things.
Yeah, and it is highly individualized, meaning it's a personal, subjective interpretation that the individual is making about what happened in her early life. But in general, what I've seen is this pattern of anger, because anger has to be suppressed continuously in the family, and resentment towards the mother or anything like that definitely has to be repressed.
It's like taboo to resent your mother. You're supposed to love your mother, right?
Yeah, not only you're supposed to, but instinctive, biologically, the mother is the one that cares for you and feeds you. And so if you have any resentment against her, you cannot express it because that might mean she rejects you and that would equal death to you. So instinctively, you try to be very subservient to the mother, pleasing.
And then you have, in order to do, the pleasers have such a huge anger built up because, and I think for women, don't you think that, and I know I hate the female, but as women, we're really conditioned to, be nice, and we play with the dolls and we have the teacups, and the boys are out there, playing war and tackling, and there's a lot of it's a different kind of energy moving.
Well, we got our own problems,
Yeah,
but this talk is specifically about the daughter or mother.
But that's how I was thinking why women have so much anger, because it's like society, an angry woman is very terrible. It's she's lost her mind, she's can't manage her emotions, and we can't be angry.
Well, yeah, but it creates this problem, this conflict, an internal conflict, because then relationships is where it's going to, where that anger is going to play out. Some in some form, either as projection that you're making me angry, the guy or the person that the woman loves is making me angry, or it turns into self-anger, which is depression. It becomes a depression.
That beating yourself up so much that you can't function anymore, or you're afraid to make a step out in the world because it just feels so unsafe. For me, I think a lot of people too, they get so hard when they make a mistake that they get angry at themselves, and they don't realize how much anger they keep taking on and toward themselves. And I think that we all think that we're mad at the world, but we never examine why we're so angry with ourselves, and that kind of criticism, the negative thinking is really that light kind of sense of anger, but beneath that, there's a lot of rage that we want to get in touch with.
That's it.
Because there's power in it. It's like every time you say yes to someone when you mean no, you're like, it's like a pocket of power you just stuffed. And you imagine your whole life just stuffing that power. And then it's like a boiling underneath. And the persona's like, no, we can't show our anger. And everyone smiles. That all of a sudden it's going to have to be dealt with. And it's going to show up in other people being angry, disappointed in you, like causing problems. And you think, why are there's so many angry people out there? Yeah. And you're like, well, they're in your consciousness because they're a part of you in some way, and we have to retrieve that projection.
Yeah, and then the pop psychology that's out there doesn't help because they split everything into good and bad. So they say, there are these negative emotions like anger and shame and guilt. And no emotion is negative or positive. It's just an emotion, meaning it's a biological response to the environment. It's there to tell us what is happening, what is the meaning of things that are happening. But when they split it up into good and bad emotions, now you're trying to get rid of this anger or this shame or this guilt. And that's not what it's about. Jung says you have to integrate that. That's your power right there. If you try to get rid of it, all you're doing is driving it deeper into the unconscious and saying, I'm not angry. I'm going to pound a pillow or I'm going to go for a run.
I'm not an angry person. I'm spiritual, right?
Yes. And there's no power in that, right? And so you end up projecting it again, that they are the powerful ones. The government, the people, the men, the society,
There's
the
horrible men out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Or the rich people. And
somebody out there, that's projection, essentially. You see the power, but you see it outside of yourself.
So anger is a suppression of power. Passion is the expression of power. And anger and passion are actually exactly the same feeling, except one is stuffed and one is expressed. And so anger, passion expressed is, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Like you just kind of, that force that says, I want to live. I'm tired of mediocre life. I'm tired of pleasing everyone. And you have to kind of get angry first in order to tap into that anger, that power. If you say, I refuse to be angry, all that power is like this gold mine sitting in your psyche that you're not using because you think it's bad, but you can transmute it and express it in a different way. And so the ego has this funny thing about labeling things, and it has a preconceived, the label that we give it makes it either negative or positive, but ultimately the ego's deciding what's negative or positive. There's no like general thing. With that said, I have a question for you. What about people I know we'll get this question about, what about the mothers that are really bad, that hurt the children, that put them in dangerous situations, leave them on the street corner, like really like drug addict mothers or, something like that. How would someone who is, approach that idea of neutrality, of not negative or positive?
Yeah, that's a whole other kind of different level of understanding what imprints the child gets from that experience, because then you're saying, well, the mother role was not there for the child, right? There was no adequate mothering for the child, and that sets up the individual for a whole different experience, because then their sense of self becomes warped in a sense. It becomes very different than the person that has a mother role to identify with or to reject. And there you get into personality disorders.
Because they don't have a strong ego?
Yes. Personality disorders we can think of as disruption of the self-image. The self-image never gets really evolved. In Jungian terms, the person never is able to develop a viable persona for themselves.
So that's the key, is that the persona shadow, the stronger that is, the easier it is for someone to kind of individuate. But when someone doesn't even have a strong persona because they never had the mother, because especially if they're a woman, the mother is the template for her to use. But
so the primary effort there would go towards helping the person develop a persona first of all. Because they haven't done that. It
doesn't mean they're broken for the rest of their life or broken at all. It's just that
the work would be different. It wouldn't necessarily be individuation. It would be persona development. That would be the primary effort, and they would benefit more from that
first, and then they can individuate.
They can individuate.
So a lot of times when I hear these stories, the terrible mothers. I mean, I've heard, many, many thousands of stories. I always ask the client to find a person that was a mother figure to them. I said, so who was there for you? Well, my grandmother, or the person that was my babysitter was very loving to me, or the neighbor, or my aunt. There's always some mother figure, and I feel like we all have. Someone's always there to take care of us in some way, or we wouldn't have survived. So let's look at that, and then that relationship becomes the template that the child. But then the child has like split kind of idea of because it's not really their real mother, but it's kind of a surrogate.
Yeah, again, it would depend on the individual, because at this, at the same time where all those principles apply that we spoke of in the beginning, it's an individual interpretation. Because I've seen people that go through hell and they come out okay because their interpretation is, I'm strong and I'm going to make it any way I can, and I'll just figure out this mother thing as I go along, right? And they do fine. But people that are given sometimes the interpretation by professionals that they receive bad mothering, that becomes their narrative, their story, and they internalize that this is who I am. I'm somebody who did not receive proper care, proper mothering, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And they wear it as a badge, like it's something that you can't, like. Here's the thing: is for me, I felt like I couldn't undo my relationship with my father. Like that's just my lot. Basically, it's part of my, my brokenness, and we want to say that you're not broken because maybe you didn't have the ideal relationship with mother, that you have pure potential. It's just recognizing the limitation because of that experience and then being able to transcend it, because we all can transcend that. Because like I say, you're the spark from fire, which is you're identical to the divine, which has never been broken, has never been damaged, can't be cut, can't just be destroyed. And that essence of you, your soul perfection, is not even touched with all the experiences. So that's really the big picture. Another experience of the mother, which I read about Jung in his, there's a book by Claire Dunn called The Wounded Healer, about Carl Jung's life. And she talks about Carl Jung's mother really wasn't there for him. I don't know if she was working or something.
I think she meant more emotionally.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, emotionally. And then his nanny was very loving to him. So he had basically two mothers. And when he, got older, this woman said, this is probably why he had the affairs, because he never thought one woman could hold everything for him in his life. So unexamined, a man seeing a split mother, he's going to need more than one woman, because that's kind of what was conditioned in him to feel safe in the world. And I just thought that was fascinating. And how many of us, even our clients and those of you who are coaches and therapists, have come from mixed families now, where you have a stepfather and stepmother, or multiple people coming in and out of your life, and how that influences that kind of formation. But you're saying that if it got divorced at 12, you're really still working with that initial imprint from the mother under 6.
Yeah, I mean, a good way to think about it is through that narrative idea, right? That the narrative we create ourselves, and then the narrative that is given to us by our culture and society and other important figures in our lives. Like if we go to a psychologist or a therapist or a priest and they tell us, you're broken somehow, you're damaged.
You have this label in the DSM-5. And
yes. Then that becomes the way we experience ourselves in the world. And ideas, words, narrative, very powerful in our minds, because that's the way we make meaning of life. There is no other way for human beings to make meaning out of life except through that narrative. So whatever your narrative is, you create that meaning for yourself.
And also, your mother kind of tells stories all the time.
Yeah.
Most of our mothers will tell us stories and how she sees the world, or like share with you what, because women are more chatty than men usually. And I remember my mother just telling me all these stories and like teaching you about the world. And fathers, I'm sure, tell their stories too. And so that's kind of impacting how you see the world too. You start to see it like the family sees it and the culture sees it. And then it's more than just that individual, but almost like generations of people. And you find, like I said, my mother was the loving mother, but my grandmother was the cold, distant mother. So it's like I inherited that part too, and it's not only, and then my mother's mother was very nurturing and loving too. So, and I'm sure her mother, my grandmother's, and my Nana, who was pushed my father away, I'm sure her mother wasn't very warm either. And it's just like that, it didn't start with your mother, like that idea, the cause, like where is that cause begin? That's the question.
Yeah, so it goes back to conditioning, because if you think about what we were saying about the individual, right, how all of us go through this early period of conditioning in the family and experiencing that emotional imprint early on. That means our mothers and our grandmothers and our generations before them, they all went through the same thing. And so the way they were acting towards us and the way they were mothering us was simply the way they were conditioned, and they learned to be a mother. And so we can't blame them. And that is where a lot of people kind of get stuck.
I have to forgive my mother. I have to forgive my father.
Or not only, that they have to hate their mother.
Oh, yeah.
Right? That they have to resent their mother. And that is very damaging, because you're never able to move on. You're holding on to a narrative of that person hurt me, that person did something bad to me, or they didn't fulfill my needs, my wishes. Now, think about that principle of projecting that then onto the world.
Everyone's a disappointment.
Everything you experience then in the world becomes a reflection of that imprint that you have. That the world is not going to be just. It's not going to give me what I need. It's always going to frustrate me. It's always going to be working against me, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
And so we want to iterate that your mother's not a bad person. And then a lot of people that have kids, a lot of our clients that are older and they have kids that are grown up, they're like, oh my God, what did I do to my children? And you can't blame yourself either. You can't blame yourself for anything that you're not conscious of. And I think that's so important, because all of us, especially people that are listening, you do personal development. You want to be a good person. You want to better yourself. And a lot of us, the more we find out about our patterns, and why are you looking at me that way? The more we're hard on ourselves for what the mistakes we made in the past. And then it becomes like, I don't want to look there anymore because it just makes me feel worse about myself. And we have to understand that the ego, when the ego is in control, you're not driving. The ego's driving, this conditioning's driving, and you're in the passenger seat just watching and going, why is this happening to me? And feeling all the feelings, but the ego's actually driving. And so this work is really about understanding the shadow so we can transcend the ego. Not just making the persona better, because making the persona more confident, better, bolder, rejecting something to be something else is only going to build more conditioning and act out of that. And you're still not in control of your life.
Yeah. And a lot of people that we take through the shadow work tell us it has improved my relationship with my mother, with my family in general.
And the partners too?
Yes. So let's leave this talk with that idea. How does it improve, or how can people create, especially women, how can they create a better relationship with their mothers?
Well, for me, it's that it's just like if you want to have that song, if you want to be closer to, if you want to be closer to me, get closer. I want to be closer to you. I got to get closer to me or something. I don't know. You know that song. If you want me to be closer to you, get closer to me. You know that song? I'm not a good singer, but that's the song. I remember that song came up one time. I was in a relationship and I was like, why isn't this guy like not getting closer to me? And I'm like, oh, I'm the one who's not getting close. And that's really what I realized when my relation with my father, and then these things that we want from our mothers. Like I want to have deeper conversations, and or I want to have like a man that my husband, I want him to talk deeper with me. Well, initiate that. You bring that up and not forcing them, but what is in you that prevents you from having that intimacy? And what I realized is that it's not the other person. It's me that's holding back. It's me that's afraid of risking rejection, of risking being pushed away. That doesn't, that is preventing that intimacy. And so if we can say, look at what that other person is presenting and saying, how can I be like that? And where am I being like that? And then being willing, it's like you said, Jung said that facing your shadow takes great moral courage, because it really takes courage and a strong ego to say, I'm going to look at this, but this doesn't define me, but I want to look at these behaviors so I can be free of them, not to judge myself.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think our non-judgment translates into a better relationship with other people, because we're not just being reactive with them. We're being open and curious about who they are and why they're being that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I find there's a couple of parts that people find difficult. One of them is it's like forgiving, but it's not really forgiving, because it's more in the sense of understanding.
It's like acceptance.
Acceptance, right? That the behaviors that your parents exhibited in general, but especially we're talking about the mother here, the behavior that she exhibited, the way she parented you, was the best she could do. Given her genetics, given her culture, her training, her learning, her circumstances, that's the best she could do. And once you understand that and really accept it, then you drop it. It's not about that you have to forgive her bad deeds. It's more that you understand where she was coming from, that she was just a human being doing her best, just like you.
Even if her best was like a 1 as opposed to a 10, you're alive and she gave you life. And if anything else, we should have some sort of love for her. And I think we all do on a deep level, but then the circumstances make us suppress that love. The love that we had when we were born or in her womb, there was some love experience there. You're in this like beautiful place, connected to this other human being and being cared for and nurtured. And then you come out, and maybe that stopped when you were born. Maybe it stopped at age 1 or 2, but there was a time where you did have that. So it's not something you have to create. You already had that experience with that person. Yeah. As a human to human.
The other difficult part is accepting full responsibility for your life. Because if you notice in the narrative that, oh, somebody messed me up, right? And this is prevalent in our culture, that we think our parents messed us up somehow. That I'm this way because my parents messed me up. No, if you accept full responsibility, that means you're not blaming anybody. You're not blaming anyone,
including yourself. So a lot of people think self-responsibility means self-blame.
Yes, you're not blaming yourself either. You're understanding what behavior is, what genetics is, what conditioning is, what society is, what socialization is. And you're seeing things as they truly are, that you're free essentially to create your life from this moment on any way you want to. But you have to accept responsibility. If you hold on to the narrative of, I was damaged, I was broken, I was hurt by somebody else, you cannot create anything new, because you're stuck in that narrative.
And I do feel like it feels challenging at first when people hear this, because they're so, I think people get, and I know for me, I got something out of being mad at my dad and being like, he's the bad guy, because it takes the responsibility off me. It's like, I didn't have a say because he wasn't loving. So it's his fault that I don't have relationships in my life. And it's my mother's fault that I don't have this, love or abundance or whatever we're missing in our life. And then when we accept responsibility, that's really where the power comes back. Is like, okay, I understand my conditioning, and there's a way out of conditioning. Like the Buddha says, there's suffering, and then there's a way out of suffering. And the way out of suffering is not just to create a shiny new persona that feels confident in herself. It's even deeper than that. It's that connecting to what's the true you, which is the part of you has never been damaged, never been harmed. And imagine you seeing yourself as divine and then seeing other people as divine, and then you see their humanistic traits, but you realize there's more to them. What a beautiful world we would be in. We'd be in greater understanding. Don't you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what it's about.
All right. Well, juicy topic. If you have questions, make sure you post them below. We'd love to hear. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. We're on Spotify. We're on iTunes. Just look in the links below in the descriptions and find out where those links are. We also, if this intrigues you and you want to be a coach and you're saying this stuff is interesting, I'd love to be able to share this with others. We do have a coach training that we do 3 times a year. So there's information below in the links to find out more about that. And of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel by pressing the button on the bottom with our little logo, and it'll help you subscribe right away.
Thanks for watching.
So we'll see you next week. And remember, you're perfect and divine in every way. And so is your mother on a deep level.
Stay well.
Take care. Bye-bye.